Venus for years was not, back in the day, right? People would look up into the sky, right? And they would say, oh, there's the morning star. And then in the evening, they'd say, oh, there's the evening star. And then years later, they discovered through scientific discovery with a power, telescope that, oh my goodness, they were looking at one and the same object, Venus, the planet. But those are two meaningful languages, right? Morning and evening are not the same concept. They're not one and the same thing. They're two different times of day. But the object is the same. It's the same star, but calling it the morning star that we see in the morning is meaningfully different than the evening star, but that doesn't mean that they're two different stars. By analogy, right, maybe the mind and the brain are like that. When we talk about beliefs and brain states, maybe those are two meaningful ways to talk about what's going on. Maybe we have a brain state name for a belief state, and that's the physical description, but we also have a more mental description by calling it a belief, a propositional attitude or something, philosophers like to call it. But those are referring to one and the same thing that goes on in the brain when you believe something. Now, I want you to think about real quick, I'm going to give you 1 minute, and then we're going to jump into dualism real briefly today before we end. So far, do you think Plato and Descartes' kind of dualism is more plausible, or do you think identity theory is more plausible? I'm going to leave eliminativism aside for the second. So jot down your answer and why you hold it, and then in about 30 seconds, we'll come back together. Or you might also pause the video. That would be another way to do it. Pause the video before you continue on with the lecture. Write down your answer to this question, and then we'll continue. All right, what we're going to do next here is we're going to look at the dualist view of the human person. Let me grab something real quick. All right, J.P. Moreland. Okay, this is the other paper, one of the other papers you were to have read for this week. J.P. Moreland holds that identity theory is false, okay? And he wants to convince us of that by having us consider, 5 reasons for thinking dualism is true. 5 reasons for thinking identity theory is false. Therefore, some kind of dualism is true. All of his arguments have the same structure. They're not the same argument. But what he's going to do is show that there's really not just one thing that's true of human beings, but two in each case. And so if identity theory is false, so that implies logically that some kind of dualism or duality is true of the human person. So here we go. Number 1, mental and physical events are distinct. Mental and physical events are distinct. All right, what does he mean by that? Mental events are characterized, okay, what they are like is thoughts. Thoughts are a mental event. There's a sequence, there's a duration and time, but that's a thought, right? Having the thought about this material right now, a thought about what you'll have for lunch later today. Feelings of pain. Now, surely those are physical events and they might even have a physical location, but that's the sensation of pain. But what it's like to feel pain, or think of pain that isn't sensory, like mental anguish and suffering. Feelings of pain, right, are mental and distinct from the sensation of pain. The experience of being you, the individual person, or the experience of being me, Chad Bogosian, what it's like to be me is a distinct, conscious, mental series of events, right? Or I would like you to, let's say, picture some ball in your mind that you played with as a child, maybe with a brother or sister or with a neighbor. Okay, I'm picturing a soccer ball. I like to play soccer. I had a couple different soccer balls when I was younger. And I've got one before my mind right now, which I'll come back to, but I want you to think about that. I'm envisioning it, right, in my mind's eye, so to speak. And I see its shape, its colors. I'm envisioning even events and playing with it. But that's a mental event. That's distinct from the physical event that's going on, right? That can be described by chemicals and electrical currents and so on, right? So the mental event is distinct, even if it's occurring at the same time. It's distinct from the physical event, which is an event that's characterized wholly in terms of chemical movements and electrical signals and impulses and so on. Now that's important, right? Because even if my brain is active when I'm having a thought of this soccer ball, it doesn't follow that the thought just is the chemical movements. And that's because, again, what Moreland is going to say is right. Even if we've got your brain hooked up to a neural scanner, we're not going to see that thought. We're not going to be able to read that thought off the area of your brain that's lighting up. You still have to report and tell us what thought you're thinking. So maybe it gives you pleasant, right, memories to conjure up that object that you played with your brothers and sisters or whatever. So the pleasure centers are lining up, but that's very different than saying we see your thought of a soccer ball or a baseball or what have you. And so I want you real quick to think of Miami. Miami. What comes to mind when you think of Miami? You might pause the video right now and write down what comes to mind when you think of Miami. Now, lots of things could come to mind, and I'm not looking for any one answer. Maybe you thought of a professional sports team, or the beach, or palm trees, or wealthy people, or celebrities, or, I don't know, crime shows, or whatever, okay? There's all sorts of things that come to mind, but here's the point. What you think about when you think of Miami is something that's unique to your mind and is not a feature of your brain, even if your brain is active. We won't cut open your brain and find your thoughts about Miami. And so the second thing that so let me go back here. If mental and physical events are distinct, then they're not one and the same thing. If they're not one and the same thing, that implies two different realities. Therefore, some identity theory is false and some kind of identity theory is false and some kind of dualism is true. Reason number two to think that identity theory is false. You have unique private access to what's going on in your mind in a way that no neuroscientist or brain surgeon or a friend of yours does. And that's probably good, right? Aren't we glad that people can't just peer into our minds? And we maybe even found ourselves saying, look, you don't really know what my intentions are here, or my motives, or what's going on in my mind. And maybe sometimes it's good, right? Because we have not so positive thoughts about other people. But what's philosophically important here is I could ask you what you're thinking, and you can be privy to that without ever telling me. And then I can only be made known of that, right? It can only be made known if you disclose that to me or anyone else. Same for the brain surgeon who's an expert looking at a CFMRI scanner. They could ask you the same question over and over and see your brain light up the same way, but they don't know what you're thinking until you tell them, because you alone have private access. And so you're immediately aware of the thoughts of the table in front of you, or immediately aware of the thoughts of how hungry you are, in a way that no one else can be immediately aware of those. We are only mediately aware, right? You're the mediator between your thoughts and us. We are made aware of your thoughts by you reporting them, but only you have unique access, and that implies that your mind is different from your brain, and therefore they're not the same thing. Now hang with me here. This is an interesting one, and you can get it, but it takes a little bit to get your mind around. Moreland says in his paper that your thoughts are incorrigible for you. That means they can't be, they're true for you. You're certain of them. They can't be corrected, right? Initially, if I ask you what you're thinking, you can tell me, you know, that's what you're thinking, right? I can't say, that's not what you're thinking. You're going to say, like, dude, knock it off, man. You can't possibly say that. Same for feeling. You know what you're feeling, right? And if I say you're not feeling that, well, no, your thoughts and feelings are incorrectible for you. But that's different than saying, okay, get this distinction. That's different than saying that your thoughts can't be mistaken. Okay, you can be certain of what you're thinking, but that doesn't mean that your thoughts are accurate representations of reality. So if I ask you, well, what do you think of that person that just walked by? And you say, well, I think they're a jerk. And I say, well, why do you think that? And then you say, well, you know, they were wearing such and such a kind of clothing. Only jerks wear that kind of. And now I press on that. And I say, well, okay, well, you're certain that that's what you think about them, that they're a jerk. But here's an argument for thinking that's false, right? That maybe they're really kind people. Look, Mother Teresa wore those kinds of clothes. I'm just kidding, right? But you get the point, right? So if I could come up with a counterexample to your claim, even though you're certain of what your thought is, it doesn't follow that your thought is true. And that's the distinction. So you can be certain of what you think, right? That's not correctable, but what is correctable is whether it's true or false. And so Moreland says this is an important way in which the mind and the brain, thoughts and brain activity are distinct. They're not one and the same thing, therefore they're distinct. Identity theory is false, and therefore some kind of dualism is true. Brain events are things that you don't have access to, right? Only someone who can look at your brain on a screen or cut your head open and look at it, only they have access to it, a third party. You're only going to have access to it if they do and can show it to you on a screen or on a picture. But you don't have unique access to your brain events, right? But you do to your mental events. Number 3, there's a unique conscious first-person experience or quality to your first-person experience. All right, J.P. Moreland in his paper is actually leveraging an argument here from the other paper in your book, What It's Like to Be a Bat by Thomas Nagel. In that paper, Thomas Nagel says, look, bat consciousness is unique to bats. No matter how much we know about bat brains and bat sonar, we will never know what it's like to be bats. And let's suppose that my son wants to be Batman for next Halloween. And so I build a bat sonar, I strap it onto his, virtual reality glasses, and I interconnect it because I'm good at this sort of thing. I build him some wings. I say, okay, let's get up on top of the roof and you're going to flap your wings and you're going to know what it's like to be a bat. No matter how sophisticated that VR contraption is, he will never know what it's like to be a bat. It's only assimilation. Just like no one who is a human being that does not have their hearing intact, cannot hear, doesn't know what it's like to be a human who hears. Frank Jackson in his paper, There's Something About Mary, uses an example of a scientist who is visually impaired, cannot see, but knows all there is to know about eyes. And let's suppose there's a breakthrough in medical science and Mary is able to have her sight restored. Mary will gain new knowledge of what it's like to see red for the first time, even though she could describe red in scientific terms and she could describe what it's like to see it in seeing red in scientific terms and what happens when the things hit the eye a certain way, but she didn't know what it was like to see red. That's important because consciousness has a unique phenomenological quality to it. What it's like to see, what it's like to hear, what it's like to be you is unique to your conscious experience of the world, and that is a mental thing, not a brain thing. How we know that, right, is as Frank Jackson, who is a physicalist, by the way, pointed out, is that, there's something, we can know all there is to know about you and how your brain is working, but that's not the same as knowing what it's like to be you. We can know what it's like, we can know everything there is to know about bat brains and how they work, but we won't know what it's like to experience life as a bat. A visually impaired scientist can know everything there is to know about how the eye works, but not know what it's like to see. And that implies that our knowledge is not wholly knowledge of physical stuff, and it isn't just itself physical. There is some non-physical, non-material aspect to knowledge, thought, and therefore conscious experience of the world. Identity theory is false, and therefore some kind of dualism is true. All right, keeping things moving in interest of time. Number 4, intentionality. This will come up in one of the other papers by John Searle. Intentionality was something that was really discussed a lot by the psychologist Franz Brentano over a century ago, roughly. And then his student, Edmund Husserl, who popularized this in the phenomenological movement in philosophy. And Martin Heidegger, maybe you've heard of, and so on. Phenomenology is a different school in philosophy. But the early phenomenologists like Edmund Husserl and psychologists like Brentano said, what's unique about the mental lives is that our thoughts are directed, right? They're about certain things in the world that are physical and real physical, tangible objects, but the other about quality of thought is not a feature of the object, and it's not a feature of my brain. My thought of Miami, what comes to mind when I think of Miami, is not a quality of Miami, right? What my thought is of. It's right when I'm thinking of that, that's not my thought isn't embedded in Miami, right? And the ofness or aboutness isn't part of the city of Miami. It's a feature of my mind. And it's mental, it's non-physical. It's not a brain quality or a brain state. And so to illustrate this, I want you to think about this car. This is a 67 Ford Shelby Mustang GT500. This was popularized in the Nicolas Cage film from many years ago, Gone in 60 Seconds, which he named Eleanor, and he was trying to steal it, and he couldn't steal it. He was a car thief. Okay, now here's the thing. I'm going to take this picture away. Now, you just thought about that car. Yes, you had a visual stimulation of it, but now I've taken it away and you're still thinking about it because I'm asking you to. But your thoughts about that car, if I said, man, that's a dream car, I wish I could afford, I wish I could have one day, but I won't because I'm a philosopher and can't afford that. Well, my thought about that Mustang, right, is not a feature of anything physical. The car, my brain, my body, or anything else. It's a feature of my mind, but that's a mental fact, a mental truth, right? Intentionality, what my thought of that car, what my thought is about, is a fact, feature of my mind, my conscious mind, not a feature of my brain. Therefore, the mind and brain are not the same thing. They're distinct, and some kind of dualism must be true. Okay, now physicalists have a reply to this. Physicalists say, well, listen, maybe thoughts about something are really our ability just to get an input, the visual input of that Mustang, right? And then we process the input, give an output, and that advances some new internal physical brain state. The problem with that, says Moreland, is that computers, right, receive inputs and give outputs all the time, but they lack awareness of their inputs and outputs and what's internally going on. Humans, on the other hand, right, are often aware of our inputs and outputs. You're not just aware that I'm asking you to think about the car. You're aware that you're thinking about it, and you're aware of what you think of when you think about it. So you have higher order awareness, we call it. And so being consciously aware of things is unique to conscious minds, and that's not a physical fact about us. That's a mental fact. Identity theory is false. Therefore, some kind of dualism is true. All right, last but not least, and then we're done for today. Dualism better accounts for what it is to be the same person over the course of your life. Now, this is really giving you a benefit of the dualist view. So this is what his most positive argument for dualism. Why I think that dualism is better than physicalism? J.P. Moreland's answer is, we have a deep interest in understanding what makes me the same person, self, over the course of my life. What makes me the same Chad Bogosian as when I was 12? Now, same in a certain sense, right? Obviously, I'm different. I'm taller. I weigh more. I look different. My hair is different. I have less of it. It's not as hip and cool as it was when I was 12, let's say. I'm less able-bodied because I'm getting older. Okay, and all that, right? Now, but I'm still Chad Bogosian, right? So if my mom, who is now in assisted living, right? I talked to her yesterday. If she sees me, she's still going to recognize me as her son. And maybe she has a picture of me in my 12-year-old soccer outfit. She says, oh, where's time gone? Where's my son, right? Well, what she's saying there, right, is she's, number one, she's acknowledging that I'm one and the same person in a certain way, but I'm distinct in others. And so the question here is, what explains, accounts for my whole life being connected together? What's that thread? What Moreland's answer is, I'm the same self or soul that continues through the entirety of my life, even though I undergo physical changes constantly. Those are accidental changes. I didn't have to have dark hair. I could have had light hair. I could have had more hair all of my life instead of thinning out at my age or what have you. All right, now, this is important not only generally, but for moral reasons, right? If physicalism is true, you are never, strictly speaking, the same person over time. You're just a space-time worm that makes your way through time, who's constantly gaining or losing parts. This is often called the bundle view of the person. And David Hume, the philosopher Hume, had this view, and many others. This is the physicalist view. The problem with this view is it brings into the question, like, well, why would you be afraid of your future if, strictly speaking, you'll never be there, right? When you get to your future, whatever you're thinking of 10 years out, that's not going to be you because, strictly speaking, you're not the same person. What's worse is from the moral and legal domains, we could never hold people morally accountable for what they've done in previous stages of their life because they're not the same person. DNA would be insufficient to establish that they're the same person over time, right? We're constantly gaining and losing cells. About every 7 years, our cells die off and we have new ones. Now, our DNA is a match, but we're not the same physical entity. That's the point. And so Moreland says, if you want to have a robust view of the person that helps pin down and unite you being the same individual in a deep metaphysical sense over the course of your life, you need to say that we're the same soul or self that grows and matures in our character and personality, but that gains and loses the physical parts, but the soul stays intact throughout the course of your life. Without further ado, I want to leave it there for today. I'm going to pick this up next time because we're going to talk about free will and determinism. And I want you to think about dualism and physicalism and its implications for free will and determinism, as well as for views about mortality and immortality, which some of the readings are about. So give this quote a good read. I'll leave it up here for a second. Otherwise, have a great rest of the week. I'll see you back here for the next lecture on free will and determinism.